Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the first day. Thank you all for joining us to learn and share and talk about pollination isolation strategies using cages and tents and some creative ways to do that. So there are 4 of us. We're going to be doing a fairly interactive presentation and answer times, sort of short question and answer after a few divided sessions, and then we'll have a larger time at the end. But we know this is the end of the day, and it's a long day, and you've been pumped full of lots of inspiring and exciting information, so we're going to try and keep you on your toes. This is a live broadcasted webinar, so welcome to all of you who are here as well, but also welcome to everyone who's joining us online through our friends and partners at eOrganic. And take a moment to also thank our sponsors. Without their help and their generous donations, we would not be able to gather and share all of our information, expertise, and knowledge. So thank you to all these sponsors that you see up on the screen. With that, I am going to get us started with introductions. My name is Laurie McKenzie. I am with Organic Seed Alliance. I'm the Northwest Research and Education Associate. I manage our main research farm site where I do trials, plant breeding, and seed production.
And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jen Cody, and I have been working in Canada for the last 4 years on a care seed research project, and through that process, I have become quite intimate and friendly with many different types of pollinators, and we will get to that part of the project later.
My name is Shaina Bronstein. I work for Vitalis Organic Seeds. I'm the Pacific Northwest rep. I live in Newberg, Oregon. And we sell our seeds through dealers. So we're a breeder producer company, and we sell through dealers like Johnny's, Osborne Seed, Fedco, High Mowing, West Coast Seeds, and those kinds of places. In a past life, I worked for Harris Moran Seed Company as the basic seed manager. And in that role, I managed small seed productions in cages. And that's why they asked me to speak today.
And I'm Chris Thoreau. I work with FarmFolk, CityFolk in Vancouver, as well as the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian seed security. I've been working with Jen on our carrot seed research project in BC for the past 3 years. Also have a bit of an affinity with flies as well, so I'm looking forward to getting into things.
All right, so we're going to go forward in time and back in time a little bit with our slides. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk to you and share with you about today, we're going to actually start out with some questions because we want to make sure that we are hitting some of the things that are most burningly interesting to you. And then we're going to give you some PowerPoints and some photos to demonstrate some of the structure and design characteristics of isolation structures that we have worked with. Jen and Chris are going to talk about pollinator management and production, and then Chris is going to talk about some of the economics that he's worked out for the seed work that they've done up in BC. We are all from the West Coast. I forgot to say I'm from up on the Olympic Peninsula. Our main office is in Port Townsend, Washington, and our research farm is in Chimacum, Washington. So I think there's some beautiful photos that are going to play here. So anybody have any burning things that you want to know about isolation cages and what it might be like to do pollinator management?
Yes, so up at the back there.
Oh, good way to isolate corn. So we're not going to answer these right now. We're just going to throw them up on the board.
And this is sort of your opportunity, because I've been in a number of, not here, but in other conferences, times when I came in with a question that was really important to me, and then the speakers sort of had that knowledge in their hip pocket, but it took so long for them to get to that. This is sort of the opportunity to put it out there so that you don't leave the workshop feeling pissed that we didn't ever talk about what you wanted us to talk about. So just back there.
Yeah, that got people thinking. Great.
Great,
I'm going to
yeah.
repeat your question so our friends online can hear. So the question is, what are easy crops to start with or low-hanging fruit if you are just getting into isolation cages?
Yeah.
I'll actually.
Okay. So, Kaylee. Okay,
So we've got a farm that's close to a community garden and interested in using cages and isolation structures to be able to do seed production right next to neighbors who are also growing. Yes? Yes. Success and failure rate. Basically, how many times do you have to try before you get it right? Still working on that? Okay. This is a wonderful list of questions, and a lot of which we're going to cover, and we will do our best with the things that we haven't had experience with, but might have some ideas about.
Oh, and Laurie.
Yes.
Then also we've got like 4 sort of major sections, or 3 major sections for our talk. And the way that we've sort of structured it is that at the end of each section, you'll have an opportunity for asking more questions. And we've given all of you equal time, just so that you know how democratic we are. And so we get 10 minutes. You get 10 minutes. And part of that is because we also know that there's a lot of expertise in the room. And while we're fortunate to be here facilitating, then really part of our role is to make sure that you have opportunity to share your wisdom and knowledge too, because we know that there's many people who have more experience than we do, or at least equal or less. So all those types of things. Anyway, I won't.
All right. With that, Shaina and I are going to talk to you about isolation structures and kind of design considerations and options. And also want to just start out by saying we've all had a lot of interest and questions from people in our lives and people that we've gotten connected to at conferences about how you do this. And we are all very much still learning as well. You know, we don't necessarily feel like experts, but we realize we've done it a few years ourselves. We've learned a few things. We still have a lot to learn, but we feel like we've got a lot to share, and hopefully we can get those of you started who haven't done it yet started ahead of where we started without much help. So there's a lot of benefits from using exclusion or isolation tents. Pollinator exclusion being one. Pollen exclusion is possible. I will say up front, I don't have any experience with that. There are meshes you can buy. There are tents you can have made that exclude pollen. They do have some challenges, and we'll get to that just in a couple slides. We're going to do some mesh specific discussion. It's a great way, of course, to provide isolation in small spaces, and when you have neighbors who are nearby. There's commercial uses, and that's what Jen and Chris are going to speak to that a little bit more. Shaina and I have done the research aspect to that, and those are a little bit different. And there's a lot of different things you can do with a cage and a lot of different ways you can use isolation structures. So you can do an open pollinated commercial production. You could also do a hybrid commercial production. You could do an inbred parent line production. You can do crosses. I've done a fair bit of multiple crosses in multiple cages in a greenhouse. You can do multiple species per enclosure. I have done brassica and carrot together in an enclosure. Or if you were really feeling confident, you could do brassica oleracea and brassica napus, or one in a cage or 2 different oleraceas, one in a cage and one not in a cage right next to each other. So there's a lot of fun sort of flexibility and creativity that I think cages allow you. So research in an enclosure can look really different. It can look something like this, which is a picture we stole off the internet from someone who wants to sell you cages. But I should let you know this is not the scale that we have operated at, but one of our partners at Organic Seed Alliance is Phil Simon at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the USDA, and he's a carrot breeder and carrot researcher. And his fields don't look quite this uniform and spiffy and clean, but they look very similar. He has hundreds of pollination cages out in his fields, and they're quite small. And in the breeding world, I found unless you're dealing with an outcrossed crop like corn, I don't have any experience with corn in cages, And I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I always welcome people to prove me wrong. We can have a more in-depth conversation about that here in a little bit. But I've used anywhere from a 5x5 cage. I've actually also done single plant bag pollinations to do selfs. But what I've mostly used are these cages. This is my greenhouse, or OSA greenhouse. This is a 10 by 20 foot cage, a 10 by 15 foot cage, a 10 by 20 foot cage, a 10 by 15 foot cage. This is a 5 by 10. Behind here, there's a 5 by 15, and outside there's a 5 by 5. So cages can come in all sorts of different sizes. And I found a 10 by 20 is actually I find it big for breeding work. Often you don't need a lot of plants, you don't need a lot of seed. And I've done brassica production. I've done kale and cabbage production in a 10 by 20. And I've got plenty of plants to feel like I'm not bottlenecking my genetics, I'm maintaining quality seed. And so you can do it. You don't need a huge cage, you don't need a big environment. And it's kind of fun to play with some of those sizes. So this is another, one thing you're gonna see is pictures of sort of different ways to do this. And this is a way to do it out in the field where you actually have got both enclosed pollination and open pollination. These are carrots, and you can actually get either self-pollination, cross-pollination, or open pollination all in the same plant. I do have a special love for carrots, especially colored carrots, for those of you who know me. If you don't and you ever want to talk colored carrots, come talk to me. But you can isolate, you can put a flower stalk or a couple flower stalks from this plant in here, and you can get a cross. And then you can have a single flower in here that you want to self, and then you can have open flowers on both of those plants that are openly pollinating with anything around it. So just because you're doing isolation or cage production doesn't mean you're only doing it one way.
Okay, so we just wanted to put a brief note in here about single plant increases, and you can achieve those with bagged plants like you saw on the last slide. I've done this with radish seed, which is fly pollinated. So what you can do is put a stake right next to the plant and then tie your mesh net bag around the plant pre-flowering. And sure, what we've done, or I've done, is include a little plastic clear tube here that you can put the fly larva into when it's time for that pollination. And that way you only put the larva in at the appropriate time. You wait till this sets seed, and then you can remove the bag. That way you're not stressing the plant by leaving the bag on there for any longer than it needs to be. And this is useful if you're just trying to do a few single plant selections. Yep.
So when I first learned, my first bagged isolation was with John Navazio doing onions in a greenhouse and trying to do some specific crosses as well as some specific individual self-pollinations. And what he taught me to do is take your bag of flies that are hatching and want to crawl out, and you take the bag and you open the bottom here and you open the bag and you just let the flies crawl up into the bag. That was also very effective.
So just a brief note, two of the really common styles of design, and if you do purchase one that's pre-made, you'll see is a rectangular Quonset style. Just a few considerations. If you're doing a tall trellised crop like a tomato, you may want the nice straight sides to maximize your space in there. Versus if you have a low-growing crop like a melon or another cucurbit, having the Quonset style can be nice. I've found that if you're in an area of high wind, the less friction points on the mesh, the better. And so sometimes that Quonset style can allow for a little less friction and you don't have the corners. So it really depends on your location and your style. I think we'll continue to talk about that on the next slides. Yeah. Oh, just one more note. When if you are going to be walking into the cage, just a note about that, like how much height you need for that design. So I just also wanted to mention that integrity of the cage is crucial to your success. So as much as you can ensure that, the better. Not introducing outside pollen into your cage is going to be key. So think about your entryways. We'll talk a little bit more about DIY styles. But when you do that, just think about how you're going to get in and out of the cage. How often do you need to get in and out of the cage? Is it going to be something where you're just going to cover it and let it do its thing, or do you need to go in there and rogue as it's flowering? And then also, yeah, just the placement is important. Just putting it in an area that's not got a lot of wind or access to, like, you don't want to put it next to a bunch of beehives where the bees are going to easily get in and be encouraged to do that.
And also thinking about your access and how often you're going to be accessing the cage. If you need to access it often to get in there for roguing or pollinator management, put it on the edge of your field, or put it somewhere where it's not in the middle of something that you're going to be working with a tractor very often, or you're really going to have to work around it. Think about where it fits into your landscape.
And then on the construction, I think it's always helpful to put the frames up prior to planting, because then you know where you want to be planting, but you can actually wait to put that mesh up until right before your plants start flowering.
It's also nice to put it up before you plant, because then you know that your planting design fits inside of your frame design, and also you're not stepping on your precious stecklings or your young plants while you're trying to put your frame up. Frames are made out of both steel and PVC. This is actually the tent you see here, tent greenhouse. This is Jen, and we're going to have her talk about her DIY cages, greenhouse cages, here in a second. If you buy cages, the place that both Shaina and I have bought from and we send people to is Redwood Empire Awning in California. They're fantastic. They will custom fabricate a tent for you in any style, in any size, and any design you can come up with. Some designs are going to be a lot more expensive than others, but they're really good about helping you navigate the process and helping you figure out what you want, and they're very flexible. They will give you a steel frame, which is kind of heavy and kind of expensive to ship if you live far away. I have found these, you'll notice this is fairly tall. I inherited tents that were 8 feet tall. I find them to be too tall. They're very awkward for me to work with. I'm a tall person, but I still have to be up on a ladder to get those frames put together. And inevitably the corners fall out and you get 3/4 of it together and then something falls out and you have to move the ladder. And I find that to be inefficient. So this year I went to 6.5-foot tents, and it's nice because you sink them into the ground a little bit for stability. And that I can do without a ladder. And my coworker, who's about 5'6", can also do it without a ladder. So that was a consideration I was not aware of when I first got into tents and tent making, but something that has become important to me now.
And just a couple notes if you're trying to decide between steel and PVC. Obviously the weight is one of them, but also where you're going to store them. If you don't have a barn or a covered space, you may want to choose something that's a little more resilient, like the steel versus the PVC. And then also we're going to talk more about how you can build these yourself. So what do you have the capability to do on your own?
Yeah, and you can do a combination, of course. You can fabricate your own frame, and then you can buy a custom-made mesh.
This is a note about the mesh. For bee and fly exclusion, a 20 by 20 mesh is suggested, and what the 20 by 20 means is in 1 linear inch there are 20 openings. So in the 52 by 52, which excludes aphids, you've got a much tighter mesh. And then one thing to think about is in these cages, they're great place for pests to breed. And so if you're thinking about using beneficials or introducing beneficials into your cages, you may want to choose a mesh that's going to keep them in, because inevitably they will just leave. Okay.
We'll skip this one.
Yeah, we can skip that. Just a maintenance, like, right, if you have a hole in your cage, fix it as soon as you can, right? Or else your whole season is lost.
And that's also a note of putting your cages in somewhere that's in your line of daily activity. So you're walking by it often and you don't have to go out and take specific actions to assess. It's just kind of, you're walking by it all the time. So these are some designs. These are actually cages in the Netherlands that Michaela brought me back pictures of this one here is a greenhouse combination. So you've got greenhouse plastic on the top, on the side with roll up sides, and then you've got mesh over the top. So you can do something like that. This is an all mesh tunnel with segmented areas. I talked to Redwood Awning about that, and they told me it would be very expensive, but they could definitely do it. These are some sweet DIYs that I took from Wild Garden Seed a couple years ago when I was visiting. I know there's a few Wild Garden Seed folks here who can maybe tell me whether these were very effective or not. But this is trying out, does it work if I use row cover? Does it work if I have mesh I have on hand? This is a nuke hive. So this is one of the hive orientations we'll talk about for small pollinators.
And then this is a picture of a cage I worked on in Peru, and they were using Velcro. So there's lots of different options for how you want to close up your cages.
All right, and then we've got just a couple photos to go through here of Jen's construction. We're going to let her tell you a little bit about them.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot more to add to it. I mean, if you're looking for sources for do-it-yourself enclosures, then Costco, Walmart, Craigslist. We just used garage frames to put that together. We put 2x4s up the top, used a little bit of twine to affix it to the top bar, and then the netting we got from Dubois Agri Innovation, which is a Quebec company, and then the type of mesh there is called Protect Net, and that's PROTEKNET. And it's worked really well. We've used that mesh over and over every year, and what I've learned is it's durable enough that when you staple gun it to the top, then you can just rip it off at the end of the year and everything is actually still okay. It's a really satisfying feeling. And then here you can see that we leave about 2 or 3 feet at the base of each side of the enclosure, and then I actually roll out nasty plastic underneath and over the top, and then put soil over the top to put it into place. And the reason why I do that is grass does not distinguish between mesh that is hard to repair later and anything else. And so what I'm trying to do is just protect the netting from getting damaged by grass growing up underneath it. So it's just one thing that we do, and then it's the fancy closing that up. That becomes really important when I start talking about bumblebees a little bit later.
And just one thing that Jen was talking about on that last slide is it is really nice to protect your mesh that you're burying, and you do want to leave plenty of room to bury that mesh, like we were saying, maybe 2 feet of extra to bury in the ground. Otherwise, if it blows up, again, the integrity of your cage is lost. And if you buy a commercial cage, they usually have vinyl sewn in the bottom.
And a note here, I don't know if this is actually one of Jen's greenhouse structures, but this is a steel greenhouse structure. So if you have an existing greenhouse and you want to use it and turn it into a pollination isolation cage, you can do that too. All right. What are your burning questions about structure and cage design? Yeah. Ventilation. Ventilation is definitely an issue. So that's a placement and a mesh issue. If you are excluding if you want to exclude pollen, include and exclude pollen, you are going to have a very difficult time with ventilation. Ventilation and shade are the two things that you sacrifice in droves when you try to do pollen exclusion. Now, that's what I've heard. I don't personally have any experience with that, but the folks I know who have say it's not the best way to go.
When you're using, like, at least in the structures that we put together, the entire enclosure is mesh. And so if you've got just the 20 by 20 and you're not excluding pollen, then it's well ventilated. And what we found is that the temperature inside the enclosure on average was only 3 degrees higher than what the outside temperature was, and there was good airflow, which was really beneficial if you didn't anchor your structure well enough, because the wind isn't going to pick up your structure and then kite it around and trash it somewhere else later. It usually stays in place. The wind just goes right through it. You'll find that you still need to, for something like carrots, still stake your carrots because they won't get quite the same wind action that they would get if they were outside of the structure. So the stalks of some of those plants won't be quite as sturdy, but in general they're experiencing similar to outdoor conditions, except by the fact that while the mesh that we use excludes pollinators, it doesn't always exclude aphids. And then you've got like some of the same issues that you'd have when you're working in any greenhouse situation. So some of the skills that people use in greenhouses are quite transferable to the skills that you would use inside the enclosures as well.
And they're, a note on that, they're often magnified in an enclosure. In my experience, in doing brassica seed production in an enclosure, I've had massive battles with aphids, and aphids can impact your seed quantity and production if you're doing something like a brassica where they suck the life out of your seed pods and your seeds. They can also vector disease if you're doing something like a carrot. They can vector some nasty viruses. So if you want to think about both of those, you're also, when you irrigate inside of a cage, and I do all of our irrigation with drip irrigation, but it also increases the humidity. So you do have a slightly higher temperature and you have a slightly higher humidity. So you're really creating a pretty ideal environment for pests and disease in a cage. And what we found, and I'm honestly going to say I have not been very successful at this yet, you want to manage your diseases and your pests before they become a problem. So it's just like on a farm and anywhere else in your farm operation. But as soon as I'm seeing aphids, I want to be ready. I tried to do lacewing introduction this year and I was just too late. So I don't know if it would have worked or not, but trying to stay one step ahead is even more magnified and important in cages. Erin?
Do you have issues if you're getting like summer rains and then you drop? No.
Issues with summer rains. It doesn't rain where I am.
We get summer rains where we're at, and it's actually worked to our advantage. Like we also use drip line irrigation where we've been growing, and what I find is actually it helps us to extend our season a little bit in September, October when we're wanting things to dry, because it doesn't exclude the rain necessarily, but it does reduce how much rain is actually falling on the plants, which for seed production actually has been very helpful in my experience.
I would add to that also, I've done cage production in a greenhouse, and I was doing it because I was trying to push my seed production into earlier flowering and earlier maturity. I've only done that for 1 year, so I can't really say whether it was successful or not, but that's another way to mitigate some climate issues. If you have some available covered area, greenhouse space is usually pretty precious.
So we're covered on that question.
Okay. Yeah.
I was price estimate on the redwood ones, just out of curiosity.
Price estimate on the redwood ones, Chris will talk about their cage, very dependent on what size, but I would say our smallest cage was probably around $200 or $300, and our largest cages are around $5 or $6. And that includes both the mesh and the steel, right? Can I do one more? Okay, one more.
How many does the mesh size for pollen?
I don't know what the mesh size for pollen is. Do either of you know? The redwood awning people would be able to tell you. They also have that. They carry that level of mesh. Okay, we're good for more. Yeah.
I haven't heard anybody talk yet about that.
So the question is about alternate day caging, and I'm assuming you mean for pollination, for getting pollinators in and out.
Well, I mean, one thing we didn't say is these cages are built to be able to walk in, but if you're doing something like that, you might not need to be able to walk in, and then something similar to row cover might be more applicable. And if you're not going to be as strict, like if one little fly gets into your pollination, you're not going to have a problem. Something more like Agribon Remay kind of row cover thing would probably be sufficient to do that, and easier to control.
And the redwood tents, ours have zippers on both sides. So you can get zippers on no sides or one side or two sides. And they are open at the bottom, so you can unzip them and you can pull those flaps back. The one thing I would say about alternate day caging, I considered doing that because it seemed like a neat way to be a little more natural about it. But I also have wild relatives that are compatible, especially with carrots. And I've got some farm neighbor who grows brassicas and often does rob. And so I would say the considerations beyond your farm operations become a little more highlighted in that situation. Yeah, Brian.
With you, in your experience, are you covering pretty much just prior to flowering?
Question is, are we covering just prior to flowering? I don't.
Actually growing them in the cage.
Yes.
I'm just thinking about mitigating
Yes. Are you growing them in the cage? And the answer is yes. And I think I am probably a little bit shooting myself in the foot by covering them too early, but I kind of get excited and I want to put them up. But I probably ought to wait until later. The thing that holds me back is I'm worried. My plants are generally breeding plants, so they're very precious to me. And I'm worried about my cage nets are kind of big and bulky, and I don't want to drop them on when I've only got 10 carrot plants and they're all really precious, and I'm kind of trying to bulk up some seed. So that's a concern that also pushes me to do it maybe a little bit earlier than would be ideal.
And I do usually put, when I see them starting to flower, just like, time to put on the mesh.
You conceivably just leave them open? Just leave the doors?
Yeah, could you conceive? Yeah, absolutely. You can leave them open. We've done that too. Was there a question over here? Fantastic. Alabama, you said Alabama. Alabama Extension Service has some great resources for mesh sizes and mitigation of heat and humidity issues in greenhouse. So with that, we're going to move on. I'm going to hand it over to Jen, and she's going to talk about pollinators.
Does that work? Aha. So bumblebees and honeybees and flies are the ones that I have the most experience with. I'm a honeybee keeper. And I've had a brief introduction with being a bumblebee beekeeper, and we renamed them grumblebees with some justification. And you can sort of think of honeybees as sort of like being the dogs of the insect world. They're domesticated. They do useful stuff. You can train them, and they're super cute. And bumblebees are even cuter than the honeybees really are in a way. They're sort of the flying teddy bears of the insect world, and everybody loves them. And but they're sort of like the cats of the insect world. They will do what they would like to do, and sometimes that coincides with what you would like them to do. And we did introduce bumblebees as one of the insects that we used for pollination one year. And what we found is that there were some distinct disadvantages for using bumblebees in enclosure. Bumblebees and honeybees are both bees. And and we all know that honeybees, when they sting you, it really hurts and they die. When bumblebees sting you and it really hurts and they live. And then when you put them in an enclosed area, then they want to defend their hive. The hive is always really close to where you are and where the carrots are. And therefore, when the bumblebees go into the enclosure, unless you have a bee suit, you're not going into the enclosure. So we thought that wasn't a plus for the bumblebees. The bumblebees, one of the advantages that they are commercially available to bring in. So you can purchase hives of bees. It costs around $400 for about a 10 by 40 enclosure. And you will get lots of bumblebees. You need to sacrifice the hive in order for that to work. The bumblebees usually last about 8 weeks, which is almost the amount of time that for carrots, at least, you would want to have pollination. And they don't require a lot of care. You want to, when you're working with pollinators, then it's pretty much the same as ranching. You need to make sure that you've got like water, that they've got shelter, and that they have adequate food supplies. And so for bumblebees and honeybees both, then the pollen that is usually within those smaller enclosures isn't sufficient enough for them to continue to be, well, they're never really happy inside the enclosures, but to live at least. And they don't always, they won't survive the process, and that's usually the same thing for the honeybees as well. Well, I found that with the small enclosures don't really function very well, just because they're always defending the hive. They're gonna, like about $400 worth of bumblebees, which is 4 hives in total, then that's about a 10 by 40 enclosure. So this is one of our enclosures here, and that big box, we provided a little bit of shade to the hive. The other thing about bumblebees is that they're likely not going to be indigenous to your population, and there are viruses that come along with some of the bumblebees that they can spread throughout your local indigenous population. And so while the companies do some virus scanning in order to help reduce the likelihood of that being a problem for you, they can import disease, and that also can be a disadvantage. And so one of the things that we were really careful about is that they had been screened and for any viruses before we brought them into our area, because we didn't want them to impact our local bumblebee population, which was quite healthy. And the other thing about bumblebees is that they're very smart. And so you can see there on the left picture that there's a lot of pollen right at the corners there, and that was the spot where all of the bumblebees were getting out. And so they were really crafty at being able to find any little gap and then escape from the enclosure. Luckily, bees have a boomerang quality to them, and they all want to come back to the hive at the end of the day. So we were able to open up our mesh and then let them back into the hive and then figure out where the escaping was happening. But it took quite a bit of maneuvering in order to keep them actually in the mesh. So how did we go from bumblebees to these? And then this is an electron micrograph of a fly larva. And so, I being a Sesame Street person, I thought that it was very Muppet-like. I quite find them adorable. And and then why are flies like super awesome for pollination and other things? And just a few like little facts about flies. And while I'm not here to convert you all to loving flies, I feel a need to talk about them just a little bit. And so flies are really the underdogs and the unsung heroes of the pollinator world. Flies, they are about 1/3 of all pollination. And so while we really like bumble fuzzy bees and we also like the honeybees, flies, although they're the ugly mothers of all of the insect people, they do a lot of pollination, and over 100 veggie cultivars are pollinated by flies. If you like chocolate, then you do like flies, because cacao is exclusively pollinated by flies. And the nice thing about flies is they don't sting. And they work really well with carrots. And so when we were thinking about working with enclosures, then one of the things that we really liked about flies was that other people had been using flies as a part of their research projects and working with carrots, which was our crop. And there's a lot of other research that talks about who visits carrots for pollination purposes, and flies are up there with that. And they're also commercially available. So we then started taking a look at about how that might work for us. And in our first year of working with in enclosures and needing to introduce pollinators, then bringing them, oops, I think I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. So let's see. So the nice thing about flies is that they're reasonably easy to raise. They're native, they're not very expensive. You can bring them in for about $150 is what it usually costs us to bring them in. And they're effective as pollinators. For us, then what we needed to learn a little bit more about in order for us to raise them was really a little bit about their life cycle. And so one of the things that we really learned is that, not that it was a surprise, but the eggs and the larvae, one of the things that is important for them is that they stay moist. And then when they pupate, then one of the things that is important for them is that they have a place that's kind of dry and away from the food sources. And like any other type of ranching, which is sort of what you're doing when you're raising flies, is they need the water and they need food, and they need a high protein source. The larvae are pretty hungry hippos, and they need a lot of protein in order for them to eat, and they need shelter and protection from predators. And so these are some of the things that we came up with help with that. And so this is our honeypot for the flies, and it's just a bucket with a ton of holes in it. It provides a shelter for the flies. In there, the best sort of way for us to work with that was to, here you can see that we also have a tote system. So we worked with buckets as one way, and then we suspended that from the top bar. And part of the reason why we lifted it up is that protected our fly population from being eaten by beetles and other predators. In this gizmo here, then one of the things that we did is we have, you can't really see it very well, but there's some holes in the side of this tote. In the bottom is some soil. On the top there's salmon as a food source and a place for the flies to lay their eggs. And in here is just sort of a protective tote. And what we would do is put that over by the manure pile. Lots of flies thought that that was awesome, and they laid all their eggs in the meat, and then the tote was put into that bottom tote, which then trapped all the flies that were in there and all the eggs that had been laid, and then that goes into the structure, and then which allows time for all the eggs to hatch and then create an ongoing population of flies in the enclosure. Ditto for the bucket. Once you get a good fly population going, then just feeding them meat and keeping the area where the larvae and the eggs are being moist, and then making sure that there's another location for the pupae to go to, then that works well. One of the challenges is in getting a good fly population going within an enclosure. Then you have to make sure that you're planning when you're going to get started with that. It takes, at the spring season, between 30 and 60 days for a fly to complete its life cycle. So at least a month or a month and a half before you're really expecting to have full flowering happening, then you want to get rolling on getting a good fly population happening. In the summertime, it's a lot easier. So pretty much at the same time when most flowering is happening anyway, then it's pretty easy to get an increased amount of time happening for that. Oi! I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, thanks. One of the things that, thanks, oh, wonderful. And this is from our first year, and so we had salmon was one of the main meat sources that we used. One of the things to keep in mind if you're thinking about what you're going to feed your flies is that the meat source that you're using is moist and has a high surface area that allows a lot of good access, both for the mama flies to come along and find like it's a cozy place for her babies, and for the fly babies, which that's how we talk about them in public. And so that the maggots can then grow and have like a really good time without drowning them, because the salmon would liquefy a little bit and then create a little bit of a soup. And so that soil in the bottom ends up making it like a much better thing. And that's like a really good environmental thing. Like you degrade all those things and they are less messy over time, but they're really smelly. And that's one of the things that my partner doesn't really like about farming in an urban area when I'm growing flies, because he finds it socially unacceptable to have that type of smell around. And so, and then you can see here that that wasn't from our wedding. Here we go. This is not our wedding rice. And so this is, but the nice thing about it is that there's the water line, and that's a nice place all of the fly babies like to have it to be moist, and then the soil underneath is a great place for everybody to pupate just a little bit later. So having the soil in the bottom worked really well because it absorbed some of the moisture from our protein source, and it created a space for the pupae to go and be in safety. So let's see. We did work with Roadkill for a while, but I wouldn't recommend it, and only because, and there was a bunch of carrot growers that really like to talk about Roadkill for a while, but we did that in private places. And, oh, I went the wrong way. And so but it doesn't have enough surface area and isn't always moist enough as a protein source. And so just as a way of being able to feed the flies as an ongoing population, and that was one of the things that we thought was important. That's sort of like a summary of what we came up with, was that flies rule and bees drool, and that in terms of cost, time, and effectiveness as a pollinator, and the decrease in the danger factor, we thought that flies were a better way to sort of work with pollinators in that setting. And I don't know, is there anything else? I think that's it. Yeah, so any questions?
Who knew fly ranching was so fun?
Yeah, fly ranching is fun, yes. Yeah, well, yeah, the question was about the translucent part of the tote rather than using an opaque tote. I think it did work out a little bit better, because for flies, then coming into something that's clear seemed to be like just a happier thing for them. Yeah, I mean, I haven't tried it, so I mean, I guess it'd be one of those things you could experiment with, but we were using clear totes.
Can I comment on that a bit? One of the nice things about having the clear tote is you can see inside it. So you can tell what kind of fly population you've got in there. That gives you a sense at how successful your trapping is.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. In the back there, Judy. Yeah, well, they will work with manure. So it's just a difference in the type of species that prefers that. So the actual house fly, then they really like manure. And then the blue bottle flies prefer to have the meat. So you'd just be changing what specific population that you would be using within the enclosures. And so the blue bottle flies are just way prettier than the house flies. Yeah, so we use meat. But it's possible, but you would just need to maintain the moisture content, because that's the piece that's really essential, both for the mommy flies to be laying their eggs and for the fly babies to be around. Then they really need it to be moist. And so if your vegetable source protein was moist, then it's a high protein content in your vegetable source of protein, then I would say that you could use something like that quite easily. I haven't tried it, but it'd be interesting to find out more about whether or not that would work for you. You bet. And back there? Yeah, where we've been, then I haven't had that particular issue. And I find that it's only a couple of days that it sort of is kind of stinky, and then it goes away. But I know that one of our colleagues was working in bear country and had a concern about whether or not that would be an attractant for bears. And it never really manifested itself in that respect, but I think you're right that, wherever you have sort of an open source of meat, then there's that possibility that you would have some predation around there. We also found that it was really important, I guess it just as an aside in terms of predators, then for the flies, then making sure that you've got your area the enclosure sealed quite well, because the beetles really like the fly larvae and they will really try to get in. We've had them like all on the sides of the enclosure, really wishing that they were like the grass was definitely greener inside the enclosure for them. And I have had birds watch me get into my enclosure, learn from that, and then I found those birds in the enclosure the next day eating all my fly babies, which was not a good thing. So that was one of so those types of things, if you have a food source, then you know that you're going to have to make sure that it's protected in some way, or that you've got it as much going as you can. So there's two questions down there.
I actually want to comment on that as well. So where we did our production last year for the project, I did it at UBC Farm, so it's a university farm. The public is there and there's coyotes there. And so that was actually something I had to design into the methodology, which is where the tote system came from. So the strategy there was to put the meat out during the day, let it collect flies and let it collect eggs, and then put it in the enclosure and bury it. And so once the larvae hatch, or once the eggs hatch and turn into larvae, they can do everything under the soil. And then you don't have that risk of predators coming in, because even if you've got the meat in the enclosure, the risk is that the predator is going to tear through the enclosure and get into there to get the meat. And that's going to be very expensive. So basically collecting your eggs outside the enclosure, bringing them into the enclosure and burying that meat worked very, very well.
And I'm going to jump in here as well that breeding and raising and ranching your own flies is great. And if that's not something that sounds fun or doable to you, you can also buy flies, and we buy them from Forked Tree Ranch. They're in Idaho, spelled just like forked, but it is pronounced forked. And you can buy other things from them as well, but the flies themselves are not terribly expensive, but they need to be overnight or at most 2 days shipped. So the shipping is expensive if it's something you're doing multiple times. You can also we have bought flies and then sustained them with some of these methods. We have a farmer that we work with nearby who has pigs, and we get pig entrails and pig parts, and we put them in a bucket or we just put them on the ground. So again, there's some hybrid strategies of buying them in and sustaining them, or growing them and ranching them yourself.
Yeah, and then at our farm, we too started out by bringing in flies through the Forked Tree Ranch folks, but as for some reason in Canada, we haven't worked out priority post yet, and it took 3 days for it to get to us, and by that time, everybody had hatched. And so we were, mother is the invention of necessity is the invention of, well, whatever, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so for the adult flies, then they like the two food sources in the enclosure, or I guess 3 depending on what you put in there. So the flies will eat the nectar and the pollen from the flowers that you have in there that you're wanting to have the pollination happen from. Usually it's not quite enough, and so for the flies, then just having granulated sugar is something that I've put out. I've also put out honey frames for them as well. So just a source of sugar. The protein is important for the female flies to be laying their eggs, and then also for the larvae in terms of that whole piece around the life cycle. So the question was around like when would we get started with getting flies rolling in order to have an adequate number of flies in the enclosure, and then also the question around 8 weeks. And so in general for full bloom, then I find that with carrots, it is like about 8 to 10 weeks full bloom. The 8-week time period was really more concerning. That's sort of, if you're bringing in commercial bumblebees, then that's usually their lifespan in that type of setting is about 8 weeks, and you'd find your population of bumblebees sort of crapping out by about 8 weeks. For the flies, then it's around, it's all about exponential population increase in a way. So you want to start early in order to get your population iterations happening early enough so that you have enough flies in your enclosure in time for full flowering. And then for flies, then the trick there is having enough population of flies in your enclosure to have full pollination. And then for carrots, then usually you're going pretty well by the time you've got 2 flies or so per bloom on pretty much every bloom. And so you want to have a really good population in there. And then sometimes that dynamic is going to be a little bit different as well, because if you have a really hot summer, then the flies like to hang out in shade and things like that. So, by the time your plants are full, getting grown, then there's enough shade for them in there as well, and some cover, which is something that they do like. Otherwise, they're going to be all hanging out on their rafters. And then you want them to feel encouraged to be like hanging out on the flowers themselves.
All right, so I know there's more questions, and Jen has a wealth of information about flies, but we are going to move on. So hold your questions. There will be more time at the end, but I'm going to invite Chris up to talk a little more about some seed economics and cages.
Yeah, so I get the pleasure about talking about seed economics, and it's not funny anymore at this point. So what I'm going to look at, I'm going to kind of look at this from the point of view of a case study and just what we've been doing in BC, particularly around carrot seed production. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the costs of production and the considerations around where those costs come from and how you can adjust them. Then we're going to look at yield and revenue potential, and then we'll just kind of look at, in the end, what the key considerations are if you're thinking about doing some sort of production in pollination cages. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I went to the shelf and pulled out John Navasio's The Organic Grower, and I thought I'd say, what does John have to say about pollination cages? And John basically says, don't do it. Because the idea is that it's quite expensive, and when you're doing it for research, it's one thing, but as you're going to see as we go through the costs and looking at it, if you think about growing something in a cage, you have all the same production costs you have to produce that seed crop regularly, plus the costs of your cage and your pollinators. So where this came from in BC as a project is there's a lot of carrots production in BC. Farmers have it at farmers markets a lot, so it seems like an obvious crop to be growing for seed. Unfortunately, we have a prevalence of Queen Anne's lace in BC, and so you can't grow carrot seed without the cross-pollination. And so bringing the cages in is a way to start producing carrot seed locally without that risk of cross-pollination. This is a participatory project, so Jen's been working on this, like she said, for 4 or 5 years. We've got growers throughout the province, and we've done that in collaboration with the University of Manitoba. So it's a really engaging piece in that way. So what I'm going to look at here is what we've done with a 10 by 20 foot prefabricated enclosure, buying in pollinators and getting a sense of what that looks like. And then we'll kind of talk around that based on some of the stuff I think we've already heard today. So I'm going to have to do this in Canadian dollars because that's what we spent. So our enclosure, we got a 10 by 20 foot enclosure from Redwood Empire Awning, and with the exchange, which was very bad at the time, we spent about $1,500 on that. So we're going to look at amortizing that on average with the different components over 20 years. So that's what we look for as an annual cost of that cage. Now, an important piece, and this kind of came up in some of the questions, is there's annual maintenance that happens on that cage as well. So we move these cages every year because we want to rotate the crop. And so that means taking it out of the ground, putting it into storage, and putting it back in again. There's time that goes into that. And the bigger your cage is, the more time that's going to take, the more labor it's going to take. And there's maintenance around it. So when we take it down, we clean it, we can give it a sanitizing spray, and that's going to help reduce any disease pressure over time. Yeah, pretty good summary there. But these are kind of absolute costs in that way. We did do a lot of our own breeding of pollinators last year, but we also bought in some pollinators because we were a little unsure about what that would look like, and we didn't want to be caught without them. So for us to bring in one load from Forked Tree Ranch is going to cost us about $80 Canadian. And that's going to be the shipping, that's going to be the pollinators, and that's also going to be the exchange rate as well. So we're paying more for that. So from a Canadian perspective, we don't have a Canadian source for pollinators. So to ship that from across the border, which is adding extra time, that's a little more incentive for us to be doing the breeding ourselves with the flies. If you're close to Forked Tree Ranch and you can get the delivery the next day, that might be a little more feasible. So your total annual cost, just in this model, is about $250 before you've even considered planting your crop. So this is a consideration there. So we've done some seed enterprise budget work for those of you who were at the Seed Economics Intensive the other day. We talked a lot about this stuff. So one of the things we did last year was take a look at all the inputs and all the labor that go into the production. So when we break this down, this $336 of labor for a 200 square foot area, which is quite small, this includes our stecklings, this includes our selection. We had to go through and select our roots, doing the planting, a couple of weedings, trellising, harvesting the seed, threshing it, processing it, getting it ready for sale. So all this is built into that cost. I won't show the spreadsheet up there. That's very bad PowerPoint etiquette. So the cost of this crop is $587 for about, for a 200 square foot area, and it works out to be about 100 row feet. So there's three things you're kind of considering with any crop, and a seed crop in particular. You're looking at your cost of production, you're looking at your yield, because often your yield and your cost of production, it doesn't matter what your yield is, your cost of production is often going to be the same. And then you're looking at what price you can get for that seed. So we need to get $130 a pound Canadian to break even on that seed. Is anybody getting $130 a pound for their carrot seed here? No. You can buy 2 pounds of carrot seed retail from High Mowing for about $130. So I don't think High Mowing's prepared to pay $130 a pound for seed for us to break even. So the question here is, where do you find the market that's going to allow you to make money on that? And this came up in a few of the presentations we've seen on economics already. We're not talking about accessing commodity markets here. We're talking about small scale regional production. And so whether you're looking at packet sales or even small scale wholesale, you're looking at probably selling to another small scale seed company. So we've got 4.5 pounds of seed to work with here. How are we going to make that $587 or so back? So we know through conversations with other seed growers, looking at premium seed markets, we can get about $160 a pound for carrot seed. So we know the reason that small scale grower can pay that price is, number one, they want to support more seed production, and number two, they're really marking that up. As they go to packet sales, your price per pound starts to hover around $1,800. Now you can only sell so many packets over so long a period. So you can't use that math as your economic model. So we're going to make some of our money by selling bulk to another small scale seed company. We've also got options in BC to sell to seed companies on a per packet basis. So I know we can probably sell 100 packs worth of seed for $2 to a seed company on a consignment basis. We could probably approach several seed companies with that, but in this model, I'm just looking at these two different sources. So we've got about $840 in sales, and we've made back the money we spent, which covers the labor that went into that and the production that went into that. So everything above that is revenue that the farm makes, so beyond everything being covered. The nice thing about this, if you've done the math on volumes there's a bit of seed left over. And so from this cage, if we've got good seed, we've got seed for our own production for a couple of years as well. So we're saving some money there. I didn't work that into the numbers, but there's a sort of a bigger picture we're looking at there. So this is from a fairly small space, but we need to access those premium markets in order to make this viable. So I want to kind of get into questions fairly quick, but I want to cover in there what the key points are there, so you're somewhat clear about that. It's an expensive enclosure at $1,500. If you've got the skills to build your own enclosure, you should do that. But you've got to make sure you're not replacing the cost of the enclosure with the cost of the labor to put up an enclosure. This 10 by 20 enclosure, I can put it up in an hour and a half by myself. I also need a ladder. But the reason we wanted an 8-foot enclosure is we wanted to have better airflow and just having more space for things to move around inside. If you can't build that enclosure efficiently, or you can't build it to maintain its integrity, you're wasting your time. And it can be difficult when it's early in the season, you've got a lot to do to get your custom made enclosure up and get it sealed and maintain its integrity. So our reasoning behind going with the prefab enclosure is it's easy. And Sebastian talked about this earlier here is, the more stress you can take away from what you're doing, you're getting a benefit there. So that's really worked into that cost. The question is, you often have more time than money. Actually, you think you have more time than money, but you really have neither. So you've got to think about how you're going to do this. I used to be a salvager. I spent all my time salvaging, and now it's way more efficient for me to buy a lot of things. It's just kind of how things work out. So that's important. Raising your own pollinators. This is a small corner of an enclosure of the flies that are inside one of the structures we did. I probably put an hour and a half of work into pollinators while I was doing other stuff throughout the season, and had thousands and thousands of flies in the enclosure without an issue. Breeding flies and raising flies for pollinators is very easy, a little disgusting, but over time you become used to it. So if you take pollinators out of the numbers I showed you earlier, it actually knocks your costs down by a third. So that's a very big saving. And that assumes you only have to bring in pollinators once. If you bring in your pollinators and they're hatching, you bring them in and the weather gets cold and it delays flowering and your flies hatch at the wrong time, you're ordering them in a second time. And once again, so you're paying for the flies and you're paying for the shipping. So these are things to consider there. Yeah, you're not going to sell, 4.5 pounds of seed to a big seed company. You've got to find somewhere local to sell that or sell it yourself. Not everybody wants to run a small scale seed company. So if you want to grow seed and you want to keep it small, doing those small scale contracts to other seed companies, that's a model that works quite well in BC. Dan Breezewa talked about that as a model that he uses. So this is a way the small scale economics are very different than when you're larger scale and you're looking for economies of scale to produce more efficiently. You can have some production inefficiencies here because you're getting a higher return on your production. The price I gave for carrots there at $160 a pound, that was kind of, it's a common carrot. That's a fairly standard price that someone can pay for that. If we grow a rare carrot, something that's harder to get, we can double that price. Now, it's not that simple because one of the reasons these other carrots, they're more expensive or they're not grown as much because they're difficult to grow. And so if a carrot is difficult to grow already and you put it in an enclosure, you're adding a bit more challenge. But if you're a good grower, there's a chance for a good payoff there. So finding the varieties that are going to work most and give you the best return. When it comes to carrots, forget the enclosure. Just grow them where there's no Queen Anne's lace. Avoid all this if you can. Don't grow in an enclosure because it's cool or fun. If you need to do it, do it. But ideally, you're going to find ways to not do it. There may be cases with other crops. We were talking earlier, Greta, if you've got peppers or something, they're a very small crop. You can cover them very easily. But when you get into bigger crops like carrots, maybe beets, corn, I've been puzzling over the corn question this whole time. The infrastructure required to do that is a little bit more. So knowing the characteristics of your crops, whether you need that isolation or not is really, really important. So don't do it unless you need to, basically. I think that's all I'm going to talk about with economics. So I'm happy to take some questions. And then, we've got another 15 minutes as well to open the floor to other questions that you want to ask about what we've discussed today.
And I'm going to jump in here real quick. We are going to spend a couple minutes just on economics, and then we're going to go back to our brainstorm from the beginning and make sure that we've hit those points and see if there's anything that we've missed.
So yeah, up there. Well, so the mesh, so here's another reason to buy good quality mesh and another reason to take the structure down as soon as you're done. That mesh really technically only needs to be outside for about 8 weeks a year. So I actually think there's an advantage to putting up your frame, having your carrots, very carefully putting the mesh over once the carrots are ready to flower. Another thing is it's at least an ecosystem then. As soon as you close it off, you've maybe trapped some stuff in there. There's different components are going to last. The posts are going to last for 40 or 50 years if you take good care of them. If you took good care of that mesh, and when you spend more on something, you often do, I think you could get 20 years out of it. If you're buying a cheaper mesh, then you're going to replace it more, and there's going to be more cost, not just with the mesh itself, but with the time that goes into purchasing it.
Yeah, and then the mesh that I've been using on my DIY structure, then it's pretty much like brand new. There's a few places where I've had to mend it, but it's been pretty darn durable. I mean, and I haven't been like super gentle with it. So far, like after 7 years of working with it, it's done pretty darn well.
One other comment on that is it also will really depend on how it's stored and where it's stored and the quality that it's stored in. So keep that in mind. What I've seen is 10 years for the mesh is pretty realistic before you're starting to get in there and have to patch holes pretty regularly, but that's also doable. So.
Also be aware that night, especially if you fold and roll up your mesh, which you're going to do because it's a big thing, rodents really like that. It's a great place to spend the winter. So they will eat holes in it and they'll nest in it. So keeping that in mind and where you decide to store it. I've found them to be successful with brassicas. I've seen them on my flowers. I've done brassicas in a cage with carrots, and I've done brassicas just in a cage and not actually done any pollinators in there because I've been trying to do some self-pollinations by hand, and I still get plenty of seed set with no additional pollinators and just brassicas in the cage.
And this comes back again to the unsung heroes of the pollinator world. And so, and I know for sure, like carrots, fennel, the allium family, and parsley, many of the fruit trees actually have a percentage that are going to be fly pollinated. So they're, I think you'd find that you'd probably, I know when I first grew hot peppers, I was just like, what the hell are all those, what the heck are all those flies doing as pollinators there? So I think there's lots of opportunity there. So Dubois Agri Innovation is the company. Yeah, you bet.
There's a link on the bottom there. We can make this available to you guys.
Relative is an interesting word, yeah. So, but I mean, I think it's quite durable as a fabric, and it has more than one use in general. And so, yeah, I think that if you're wanting to get into something like this, then you kind of have to do your own costing about whether or not you think that that's worth the cost that they'd be asking for it. That I actually got mine secondhand, so I couldn't even say.
And it varies with your weave and how much you're buying. And then when we talked about the vinyl bottoms and zippers, those are all added costs. Yeah. Do you still have a question, I think?
Yeah. So all of the flowers that I know for sure are all umbral type flowers that are, for those types of vegetable crops. And the flies that we're growing are the type of flies where you're right, it's a numbers game more than it is choosing the right pollinator in that way. I know that there are specific flies that are specific pollinators for certain crops, but those aren't really the flies that we're going after in terms of that we've been talking about in terms of growing your own. So
if you saw
you're right about that.
Some of the pictures up there, like you'll have 5, 10, 15 flies on an umbel, and they'll hang out there. They actually become very docile on that umbel, though, so they'll walk around and chill. You can kind of go right up to them, and it's like they're having a little.
I think it's also a matter of that's the only thing available in the cage. They figure it out. It's sort of a evolutionary do or die situation. I also had zinnias in some of my cages just because I love them and I put them everywhere, and I got zinnia seed set. And I was not honestly paying attention to whether the flies were on the zinnias and how much that was affecting it, but I definitely got seed set, and that's not something I would have expected for flies. I see that Hank's had his hand up, so I'm going to call on him. Yes. My biggest frustration with redwood awning is if you get a tent that requires, I think the largest pole size they make is a 10-foot pole. And so if you have a 20-foot cage, you've got an intermittent leg. And that T, where the two 10-foot poles come together, and then you have a 10-foot pole or however far going across and one going down, they don't put any sort of seam in the middle of that T. And so this post can go all the way through, and this post can go all the way through, and it's hard to tell where they're actually centering. And I find that also is frustrating when I'm setting it up. They tend to come out, like fall out of that little corner or connecting sleeve. When I worked at Gathering Together for the market, our market tents were very much similar, and there was actually a hole with threads drilled in each of those little sleeves. And so you could take a screw or an eye bolt, and once you had your leg fitted in, you could screw it down, and that seemed to hold it much better. I wish I had that on my pollination cages. Another thing to think about, redwood awning will also sew grommets into the seams, and if you live somewhere where it's very windy, some of my cages actually have bent steel legs because we get 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts, and I wish I had gotten grommets sewed in them so I could tether them down and screw them into the ground somehow. Does that end? Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, once you put two things you can do. So when we put our 10 by 20 up, we put anchors in the ground. So we put a 2-foot anchor in the ground that we can put the post in. We angled those inwards. And so when you put it together, it actually pushes everything together. Still the same problem with the T's, but it kind of works itself out. But once you put the mesh on top, that kind of keeps everything on. And remember, Shaina said, you're going to bury the bottoms of that mesh, and that's going to pull it all down to the ground. So once it's together, it's stable, but in putting it together, it's very unstable.
And if you have welding or fabrication options on your farm. We have some of that on the farm where we work, and I keep thinking every year that I'm gonna, especially those ones with the T in the middle, that I'm gonna cut them open and just re-weld, and so that I'll have enough of a weld in there to stop the post from going in. So, you know, aftermarket hacks, but I don't know if you can buy those with the pins or with that already put together. If you can, I would do that. I would not order them from Redwood Awning if you have another option.
Yeah, and if you are considering building your own, I would recommend going on some of these websites where they are, because it very clearly shows you how they join together and what parts are used to do that. So even if you don't intend to buy from them, I suggest taking a look at what they offer.
And in terms of the DIY stuff, then it was just the frames for portable garages is what we ended up using, and they've worked really well for a number of years. But the disadvantage of those DIYs is it takes longer to put them up. Yeah, and so I think we're just going to check our. We'll come back to the other questions, but we just wanted to make sure we checked off the questions that you guys talked about at the very beginning. And so one of the things we haven't talked about is the pros and cons of long-term structures versus mobile structures. I don't know if anybody.
I thought that was a really interesting question. Firstly, I think you're going to have the same issues you have with any production where you're in there every year versus something that's permanent location. Getting into till or clean it up, weed seed, or even remnant seed of your past crop can all be issues. And of course, you'd want to rotate your crops so you wouldn't be able to use it for the same species year after year. And then also longevity, at least recommend taking off the mesh. If you leave up the structure, that could be efficient and time saving, but definitely you'd want to take down the mesh, or else you'd really sacrifice the longevity of the cage.
My initial thought, I've only done small mobile cages, but my thought in that is that your larger cages or structures allow you to do commercial lots, which is my guess is what part of that question is about. And not having any experience with that, I would say you're dealing with essentially the same issues you're dealing with a hoop house or a high tunnel or a greenhouse. You know, kind of in my mind, I'm like, gosh, it'd be really neat if you had a structure that was easy enough to remove plastic and mesh, and you had a system where you could use it as both a greenhouse and a pollination production tunnel. But we might have to talk about that over a glass of wine.
And then there was another question about isolating corn and wind pollination in the tunnels. And so I think we chatted a little bit about that. The pollination, the mesh required for excluding pollen is quite dense. And so the issues end up being around moisture and not enough wind flow. So it just makes it it's a really challenging scenario to be doing that in an enclosed structure. Okay, and so for our web friends, then the bottom line ended up being that there wasn't really a mesh that was adequate for pollen exclusion that redwood could provide. Yeah, you bet. Up there. Yeah. You bet. So what the suggestion from the audience is that paper bags could be used to exclude pollen that way, but like your comment was that on a scale that just wouldn't be. It wouldn't be reasonable to do that. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it definitely is worth it.
You bet. So the comment was just around corn, and that hand pollinating corn for some specialty corns was something that that you found has been that you've been able to do.
And a side note, you can do hand pollinations of many, many, many things, and it's worth thinking about how many seeds you're going to get for each pollination you do. If you're doing hand pollinations on something, or hand crosses on anything like a pea or a bean, it's a lot of work for very few seeds. If you're doing hand pollinations on something like corn, you're getting a lot of seeds for each action of effort.
So the question was, what about 2 crops in a season? And that, yeah, you could make it work. And then we've got a question here about the low-hanging fruit for easy crops to isolate. And then, well, I started with carrots. Carrots are pretty good.
I found carrots to be also really great. My gut instinct is kind of saying something in the middle between self-pollination and cross-pollination. The more outcrossed, more strongly outcrossed, the higher your population numbers are. Then you're looking at bigger tents, which are a little bulkier to deal with. You're looking at potentially more, if you're trying to pack a bunch of plants into a small place, you're looking at magnifying your disease and humidity and those challenges, pest challenges.
Yeah, but I would say that you'd want to do the numbers breakdown in terms of like, is it worth it for me to play with my seed crops inside of enclosures? What's the cost benefit going to look like in order to do that?
I am noting that we are at time. It's 5:30, so I'm also noting we have actually addressed pretty much everything else on here. And thank you all for your time.